What's good? It's Woog. Israel Adesanya, the middleweight champ, is defending his title against Yoel Romero, the last stylebender versus Soldier of God, the Nigerian New Zealander versus the Cuban American. And I want to discuss the challenger here because I think this is one of the most unique athletes to come through the UFC. First of all, Cuba has one of the oddest relationships with the U.S. in terms of athletes being able to even get here. Throughout the years, for political reasons, Cuban baseball players weren't able to get to the U.S. to compete in the major leagues. Cuba has one of the greatest and most storied amateur sports programs in the world. Baseball, boxing, wrestling. Cuba, for being such a small country, produces elite athletes that usually remain enigmas or totally unknown to the U.S. public. Back when Muhammad Ali was in the second half of his career, throughout the 70s and into the 80s, there was a legendary Cuban fighter, Teofilo Stevenson. Americans would only see this guy in events like the Olympics and in world championships where Stevenson represented his country of Cuba. Well, he was looking and performing like he might be the best fighter in the world. People then wanted to see a dream fight between he and Ali. Well, it never happened. There's a documented history on that failed potential mega fight. Current Cuban boxers like Guillermo Rigondeaux didn't start their U.S. pro careers until 29 years old. Think about that. One of the most gifted and skilled pound-for-pound fighters we've ever seen was 1-0 at 30 years old after having an extensive legacy-building amateur career, winning all of these world championship tournaments. Cuban heavyweight boxer Luis Ortiz didn't start his U.S. pro career until 31 years old. And that's why he's just now having these big fights with like Deontay Wilder at 40 years old. Well, this fight's challenger, Yoel Romero's background is that of a world-class wrestler. There are a lot of wrestlers in the UFC. There are a lot of good wrestlers and even great wrestlers in the UFC. But when I say Yoel Romero and I mention world-class, I'm talking Olympic silver medalist back in 2000. Romero's a 5-time Pan American Games gold medalist and has won several gold, silver, and bronze medals in various world championships and world cups. But his win in 2007 would be the last time he'd represent Cuba, officially at least. After winning the Grand Prix of Germany in 2007, he stayed in Germany instead of returning home to Cuba. He would eventually transition into mixed martial arts, debuting in Germany at light heavyweight in 2009 at 32 years old. He wins by knockout. He wins his next 3 fights by knockout or TKO. He then moves to the United States in 2011 at 34 years old to compete in Strikeforce, experiences his first and to this day only knockout loss, then continues to train for the next year and a half before joining the UFC in 2013 at 36 years old. Competes at middleweight, one weight class below, so now he's at 185 instead of 205, and he goes on an 8-fight tear, which includes stopping Derek Brunson, knocking Lyoto Machida out, TKOing Tim Kennedy, controversial fight there, beating Jacare Souza, then destroys former champ Chris Weidman via flying knee knockout in 2016 at 39 years old. My God! How, at such a late age, was this world-class level wrestler able to also develop into a devastating striker? He's a wrestler, but his MMA resume is full of KO and TKO. He's got this lightning-fast explosiveness, but also a patience that builds the anticipation, picking his spots while intelligently defending himself in those gaps between his action. He's also athletic beyond belief, from flying knees to backflipping off the top of the cage apron after scoring a knockout win. This guy is freaking incredible. Not to mention, he's probably in the top 99.9% of human beings in natural physique. The dude's built like a He-Man action figure. At 40 years old. So at 40, he's 12-1 in his MMA career, 8-0 in his UFC career. He then faces Robert Whittaker for the interim middleweight title, because this is around the time King GSP returned to upset Michael Bisping for the middleweight championship, one division up from where GSP had spent his career. So Romero faces Whittaker for that interim title and loses a razor-close decision that was deemed fight of the night. Now, that GSP win over Bisping for the title and the decision not to defend it kept the division suspended for a while. Robert Whittaker is now the interim champ. Romero faces Luke Rockhold in a title eliminator and wins that by devastating knockout. One of those knocked unconscious knockouts. Not a first for Romero. He also missed weight in that fight, which wouldn't be the last for Romero. Whitaker then rematches Romero for an interim title turned actual title fight, since the official title was vacated by GSP, and Romero would miss weight again, forfeiting his chance to win the title were he to win that fight. He and Whitaker then go on to have one of the greatest but most brutal showdowns imaginable. Just 5 rounds of back and forth hell where Whitaker seemed like he was winning the rounds with boxing, but anytime Romero would explode, Whitaker would be knocking on the door of unconsciousness and would just be in all types of trouble. And then he would try to regain, Romero would gas again, so this thing was just back and forth. It's one of the toughest fights I've seen, where as the viewer, I have everything from deep admiration to sympathy for these guys. You hear the old phrase, knock down, drag out fight? This is that. And Whitaker won another razor-close decision and therefore the championship. And I'm still not sure which fighter between the two came out of that fight worse off. First of all, neither fighter would return to the cage for over a year. Whitaker tried to return 8 months later but suffered health complications hours before his scheduled title defense versus Kelvin Gastelum. The fight had to be canceled and Whitaker was forced to undergo emergency dual surgery immediately due to and I'm not kidding here, abdominal hernia of the intestine and a twisted and collapsed bowel. Good God. I'm glad he's well. When Whitaker finally did return to the cage an additional 7 to 8 months after that, he suffered an early second round knockout versus Israel Adesanya, the reigning champ. And just before that unsuccessful Whitaker returned to the cage, Romero finally returned to the cage as well and lost another razor-close decision, this time to the undefeated rank-climbing powerhouse Paulo Costa in another fight of the night. And by the way, as cool as fight of the night sounds, as a fighter and as a human, you don't want to be caught up in too many of those. Those are extremely hazardous to one's health and career. Some fighters never really make it back from one of those battles. They're often never the same. And I think that the jury is still out on what Whitaker versus Romero 2 did to both fighters. But Romero did perform pretty well versus Costa. The public was pretty split on who won that fight. Romero is now 42 and is challenging Israel Adesanya for Izzy's middleweight title. And I just saw Yoel do a back handspring and immediately hit the splits in a face-off press event a few weeks ago. So he at least appears to still be himself. But one thing I'll say that I've noticed about his recent fight style is that the gaps between those explosive actions are longer. And I don't know if those explosions are as explosive as they've been over the years of Romero's short but dynamic career. Also, Romero is a wrestler by trade, but like other wrestlers, as they get older, they find the idea of constant wrestling to be too tedious. Wrestling is definitely a young man's game. Old wrestlers simply don't get down with the same level of wrestling activity that the youngins in like college and even high school do. Wrestling is about as exhausting a practice as there is, and they find themselves spending the whole fight boxing and kickboxing as they get older. Rampage Jackson, Daniel Cormier, Dan Henderson, Chris Weidman, even John Jones. These are all great wrestlers who just prefer to bang at some point. As they get into their mid-30s, Jones is just entering his now. But he's been as much, if not more, kickboxer as he is wrestler in the UFC, more so in his recent fights. He'll turn it on with the wrestling at times, but wrestling is just so much more tiring than the boxing-kickboxing approach. But Romero has to at least establish the wrestling threat to be successful versus Adesanya here. I think Izzy at this stage should pick him apart from distance if he needs to only worry about avoiding a big bomb of a shot from Romero's fists or knees. I think Adesanya will win and will probably go for the knockout. Izzy could definitely get you out of there. But Romero is such a durable, superhuman force. He just might go the distance here, even at 42. And I could still be selling him short with that prediction. I'm cautious in underestimating Romero, but that close loss to Costa has me thinking that his game has slipped just a little. I think a prime Romero beats Costa. Prime, in this case, being 35 to 40 years old. Again, he spent his 20s wrestling for Cuba. But man, this should be a good one. Izzy obviously has his own story and background. He's one of the new faces of the UFC and has over-delivered in all of his major fights. He looks like the type that can reign over this division for almost as long as the great Anderson Silva did from 2006 to 2013. But he's got to start with defense number 1 this weekend. So there's a lot to get into with Izzy and what he's done in such a short period of time, especially in the UFC. It's just important that we spotlight this exceptional and legendary wrestler turned UFC championship contender, Yoel Romero, who will again have a shot at UFC glory this Saturday night. But let me know your thoughts on this fight. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.